Hello everyone, thank you for joining me during National Science Week. My name is Dr. Melinda Waterman and I'm from the University of Wollongong. And today I'll be sharing some information on some very important members of the Bryofight Club, mosses living in the extreme. I hope you have a hot drink in hand as we go through some of the amazing abilities that these plants have in order to live in the Antarctic environment. As you're aware, Antarctica is a large continent at the southern end of the world. But in fact, it's not as large as what's depicted in most world maps like this one here. It is 14.2 million square kilometres in size, but bringing this closer to home, it's about double the size of Australia. Australia claims quite a large portion of Antarctica, and this means that Australia is obligated to preserve Antarctica as a natural reserve for peace and science. So now let's take a look at Antarctica from a different angle, this time from space. Here we can see how much of the continent is actually covered in ice, making it such a frozen desert and one of the driest continents in the world. Here we can see there's not much left behind that isn't ice. In fact, there's less than 1% of the continent that is ice-free. About 70% of the world's fresh water is actually locked up in the ice in Antarctica. So it's quite a lot of ice, which means it's quite limiting to a lot of the organisms that live there on the land. In order to investigate what living things are in Antarctica and how they can cope in these extreme environments, we travel to Antarctica via different international programs. The Australian Antarctic Division facilitates travel via Hobart to Australian bases such as Casey, Davis and Mawson, whereas the Antarctic New Zealand program facilitates the expeditions from Christchurch down to their base called Scott Base. The first time I went to Antarctica was actually via the other side of the world through South America. So I've gone from Punta Arenas down to the tip of Antarctica known as the Antarctic Peninsula. So there's ways in which we can get to the field, and this is mainly by ship or boat. Now, fortunately, I've only taken the ship once across the Drake's Passage, and every other time getting to Antarctica has been by plane, thank goodness. And of course, working in Antarctica to look at these amazing organisms that live there, we need to be warm and hydrated ourselves because it is a very harsh environment. So you can see the amount of gear that's needed in order to keep warm in this very cold environment. And it's not as cold as you probably imagine. The coldest that I've been is around the -20 degrees Celsius mark, which is with wind chill. It can get it is a lot colder in winter, but most of the time that we're in Antarctica for expeditions is during summer where it is a lot warmer. So once we arrive in Antarctica, we usually stay in a station. Now this could be stations where there's quite large populations, such as McMurdo, which is one of the American stations, or it could be a much smaller station like Scott Base, which might house around the 60, 70 persons mark. And a lot of the times we're actually out on site camping in order to closely examine those organisms we're looking at as part of our research. So what is it actually like in Antarctica? So you've seen quite a few pictures which are showing it's quite vast. There's lots of blues, there's lots of whites, a bit of land. As you know now, there's less than 1% of ice-free land, but what about the living things? Well, of course, there's the charismatic animals like the penguins and the whales, many different types of birds, and of course there's seals. But did you know there's actually quite a lot of plants that live in Antarctica? A lot of these plants would be living in the ice-free regions around the coast of Antarctica. And this is where there is some water available in order for these plants to live. The flora of Antarctica is dominated by what we call bryophytes. Bryophytes are known as mosses, liverworts and hornworts. But in Antarctica, there are no hornworts. And on top of these moss beds, we might find a different type of vegetation. These are known as lichens. So you might be familiar with both mosses and lichens from your backyard. You can see lots of the lichens here are quite brightly coloured and have different types of structures, whereas the mosses are more leafy. Now up the top, we also have two other types of plants that are found in Antarctica, more along the tip where I described as the Antarctic Peninsula. So these plants are known as a grass and a little cushion plant. Mosses can actually dry out for months or even years on end and rehydrate when water becomes available. In these ice-free regions that these mosses live, there are some frozen reservoirs of water locked up away in ice, snow and ice. And this means that once the temperatures warm up a little bit, mainly in summer, so that's during November to February, then the water can actually become available for the mosses and they can rehydrate. This might only be for hours of the day or for some days over the summer. And so these plants can then actually start to photosynthesize, and you can see that here in the image where we've got some bubbles forming in this very icy bath. And these mosses can dehydrate and rehydrate months or even years after and come back to life, which is pretty cool. Some of our samples that we've collected have been dried out for decades and they've actually just come back to life when we've added some water. Within the moss beds, we can see how much it's streaming with life. We've got various types of invertebrates such as mites and springtails, as well as lots of microorganisms like rotifers and diatoms. There is also some really interesting microorganisms known as water bears, and these are extremely resilient to very cold temperatures and even in space. So in Antarctica, we can see that water is such a limiting factor to life. And we can see that there are areas in Antarctica that's being affected by what we do in the rest of the world. So we know that small changes in temperature can have a huge consequence on how these organisms are going to live into the future. And there are places in Antarctica that are warming quite rapidly. Other places, in fact, are keeping quite cold. And this is likely due to the breakdown of the very important ozone layer above the Earth. What it does is it reduces the amount of damaging ultraviolet radiation that comes through to the Earth's surface. So this protects us from harmful UV rays. Production and use of man-made chemicals in the 1960s and 70s actually broke down a lot of this ozone layer above Antarctica. So here in the video, we can see that the ozone depletion or breakdown has actually been occurring over Antarctica since the 1970s. And so the dark blue regions is where there's the least amount of ozone. And this allows more of the UV radiation to reach the Antarctic surface. And there's evidence that the ozone hole has caused much larger changes to the southern hemisphere climate, in particular, strengthening the winds that are occurring around Antarctica, keeping Antarctica quite cold in certain areas. So these plants need to be able to warm up in order to be productive. And on very sunny days, the air temperatures might be around 1-2 degrees, but the mosses can actually increase their temperature up to 20 degrees. And we've recently found that this is at the temperature that they're most happiest at and most productive. And because these mosses are also exposed to the elements in order to warm up, they also need to find means to protect themselves against damaging ultraviolet radiation. So this means that they might need to slip, slop and slap in order to protect themselves under these conditions. And we have discovered some of the mosses in Antarctica have been producing important compounds within their cells and cell walls that act like sunscreens against this damaging ultraviolet radiation. Having them in both locations is particularly important, but also having them in the cell wall, just like us applying sunscreen, is a very effective barrier against this harmful radiation. This is another mechanism that these mosses use in order to cope in such a harsh environment in Antarctica. And a lot of these compounds are thought to change based on the environmental conditions that the mosses are living in. And if that was the case, we would want to be able to track how they change over time. So one of the questions that we're investigating is, how old are the moss shoots in Antarctica? So we've been trying to work out how old the mosses are by collecting living samples or living cores of mosses and using them as time capsules to see whether they've actually recorded the climate as they grow. So here we have a moss core. This one's actually about 20 centimetres long. And we've been using multiple moss cores like this from around different sites in Antarctica to work out how old they are and whether the compounds are changing down the chute. So in order to do this, we've been using a type of dating known as radiocarbon dating. Not quite like this one here, but I'll explain this very soon. So how old do you think mosses are, and how slow do you think they can actually grow? Well, we used a technique called radiocarbon dating, and this is in a similar way as we would date tree rings. So with a tree, the inside of the tree is actually the oldest part and the outside is the youngest. And we can look at a moss core like this one here, looking at the base to the tip. And we can have a look to see what type of radiocarbon signal that this is actually producing and match it to the atmospheric signals to work out the exact dates. There's been quite a lot of changes in the carbon-14 signals in the atmosphere, and this is due to the changes in burning fossil fuels, as well as bomb testing in the 1960s and 70s. So we can use this as a very accurate way to date these moss cores. And therefore we can actually see how far back in time does this core actually go and what sort of climate history does it provide. So we've collected quite a lot of cores around the coastal sites of Antarctica, and here is a handful of our results. So on the east side of Antarctica, so this is just below Perth, this is around the Casey Station, one of the Australian bases. We have 3 species of moss, and on the west-hand side in the peninsula of Antarctica, just below South America, we have 3 species of moss also. And so we looked at the dates, so how old these moss shoots actually are, and how long they actually grew to give us an idea of how slow they were growing. And thinking back to the question that I asked you before, how slow do you think they might be growing? Well, on the east side, we've actually got some very slow growing moss species, up to 3 millimetres per year. Whereas on the west-hand side of Antarctica, it's up to 10 millimetres per year. So still quite slow, but a little bit faster than what we see on the east. And this could be due to the warming effects that the peninsula has been facing over the last few decades. Now we'll have a look at how old they actually are. So on the left-hand side, we have a range of 10 to 95 years old. And on the right-hand side, we have some species that aren't very old at all, and some that are very old. So this is actually quite surprising. We found that some of the cores of moss were actually 400 years old or more. Pretty incredible for such a small plant. And we can go back in time and look at the clues that are captured in the cells within these mosses to give us an idea of what's been happening in the climate. And so one of these clues in the mosses is actually a type of carbon, carbon-13. And this carbon-13 signal enables us to work out whether the mosses were living in a dry environment or a wet environment over time. And looking at the mosses from the east side of Antarctica around Casey Station, we could see that there was this evidence of drying over time. So the mosses were actually experiencing a much drier environment now than they did 30 or 40 years ago. And this shows that even over a short period of time, these mosses are actually experiencing a change in climate, showing how important it is to monitor and preserve these really important species in Antarctica. And I hope you now understand and appreciate what it's like to live like a moss in Antarctica. Whether being part of the Bryofight Club, a moss expert, or a moss enthusiast, we can see how these Antarctic plants have adapted to live in this extreme climate. We can also use mosses as living time capsules in order to go back in time and unlock the mysteries of past climate in remote locations like in Antarctica. And by breaking open these time capsules, the mosses are letting us know that there are some changes occurring in Antarctic climate. So we need to keep in mind that whatever we do in the rest of the world also influences remote places like Antarctica. Because of the changes that are occurring around the world, it is imperative that we continue to monitor and conserve these amazing plants in Antarctica, because who knows what they'll tell us about the future. Thank you for joining me. If you'd like to know more about the work that we do, there's some resources here on the slide, but also you can contact me via Twitter. Happy National Science Week.